Welcome back to Today in Space, the end of January, and we couldn't start off the year without a recap of one of our favorite space theories, the Space Conundrum. We've observed a strange pattern here on the podcast after learning my space history and being deeply ingrained in the current space progress of today. As space progress accelerates, so does the chaos in society. But why does this happen? Why are they correlated? And more importantly, where is this all heading? With the first month of January filled with chaos already, we think there's more to come this year, backed up by a lot of progress in space, thus the Space Conundrum. We're going to try and explain what the Space Conundrum is, how it led to a world-changing event the first time, and why these times, as crazy as they are actually a cycle that we've seen before. And I believe learning about human history relevant to your current era is super important to keep a level head with perspective in these chaotic times. It could possibly even prepare you and us for what might come next. We might not be able to see the future, but us humans have a tendency to repeat the past. If anything, it gives us more context on what's happening around us if we look back and learn from our predecessors. So in favor of mental health and focus in 2025, let's search for answers in the chaos of space progress and humanity. Welcome to Today in Space. I'm your space science podcast host from the East Coast, Alex Giorfanos. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in. I stumbled upon this idea of the Space Conundrum years ago while researching for the podcast. I was finding documentaries and books chronicling the early space race. I was going to book signings and doing as much as I could to learn about the parts of space that I didn't get to learn as if I was someone that was super passionate about space from an early age. Back then, I just didn't think I would ever be able to work on anything in space until I started looking for careers in college. This podcast gives me the opportunity to go the next step in my understanding, taking all the data and history and then understand it from a deeper place to develop episodes for the podcast and topics to share with others. And I've been doing this for a decade now, 10 years, and I feel more streamlined and tapped into the big picture of space than ever before. And it takes a lot of energy to do it. And in those early days of the podcast, I was fueled on almost no sleep, lots of coffee, and the energy of an ex-pack-a-day smoker, newly cold turkey, and all of that addictive energy needing somewhere to go. That way I was powering my day-to-day back then, it turns out, is not healthy long-term as an option. And I've learned that lesson a few times in my trial by fire in 10 years of podcasting about space and science. Nowadays, I'm still drinking plenty of caffeine, but I'm more focused on the consistency and reliability of creative energy. Just like any good rocket needs to consistently and reliably work, you need to tune it for performance to get the most thrust out of it, and that includes life and creative energy. It's the difference between mental health awareness and mental wealth, right? When you're taking care of all of those things. And plenty of magical H2O, sleep, physical activity, productive habits, and great food and nutrients are key for that mental wealth. Two areas I have been really good at are productive habits and great food and nutrients, because I cook all my meals with a lot of help for scheduling and getting things together, but it's something we've been doing really well. And one area I have not been good on is sleep. I think a lot of us can relate to that. And rest and recovery, for me, is on my list of habits to change for good for 2025, and it's my own personal conundrum. But the good thing, unlike the Space Conundrum, is there's a lot more control of ours that we can influence for mental wealth than we can in the Space Conundrum. We've been working with Magic Mind, and they've sent us their mental performance shot that we use daily to tune our own rocket engine for creativity. And we love it. But you also need to get into a coast phase and recover every once in a while, right? The engines can't fire all the time if you're looking for mental wealth. Lucky for us, Magic Mind sent us their sleep performance shot, and you know what? It's working great. Am I immediately in a high performance sleep schedule? Hell no. But I got a lot of work to tune a better behavior, and the sleep performance shot is making that happen. If you want to tune your own rocket engine in life, check out Magic Mind's mental and sleep performance shots and tune your rocket engine of life. User code SPACEJAN at magicmind.com and get 45% off the Magic Mind bundle. That's magicmind.com/SpaceJan. That's SPACEJAN for 45% off the Magic Mind bundle. Not everything needs to be a conundrum, especially your mental health. But let's dive into the actual space conundrum and what it means for all of us. So what is the space conundrum? It's a theory we created here on the podcast after learning the history of the original space race while watching Space Race 2.0 happen right in front of our eyes the last decade. When there's increased space progress in space travel, it correlates with increased chaos in society. And if there's one thing we can agree on, the last decade has been nuts. And it doesn't seem to be slowing down. And neither is progress in space. I recommend the following books to learn more about the history of space progress to make the connections between the two worlds during the 1950s to 1970s and the world starting in 2010 until now. Starbound by Bruce McCandless III and Emily Carney. We just had them on the podcast recently to talk about the book and all things space. Great conversation. Go check that out. But also go check out the book. It does a great job of explaining all the history leading up to today in a really easy to understand way. Chasing the Moon by Robert Stone and Alan Andrus was extremely good, and it's not only a book, but it also is a documentary that puts together so much of the historical footage and adds a lot of context into what happened leading up to us going to the moon, and there's a lot. There's also Escaping Gravity by Lori Garver, which is a tremendous book from the perspective of someone who was in the administration, dealing during the Obama years, dealing with completely changing the focus and investment in space towards the private sector to help get the U.S. space program back on its feet after the space shuttle program was retired, which Lori Garver was a big part of helping make that happen. That's a tremendous book to understand the politics behind what's going on and a little bit more about just understanding why this last decade happened and where this acceleration of progress probably started. It's people like Lori and others in that book that are described that spent many, many years and hard, long hours trying to get that to happen. And then, of course, there's Liftoff and Reentry by Eric Berger. Both of those books, Liftoff and Reentry, two separate books, are great at understanding what SpaceX has done in those early years of desperation. I think that's literally the title of Liftoff, of the early days of SpaceX. And then Reentry is understanding where they've come to at this point, and some really great stories about how rocket engines developed and all that stuff. There's SpaceX, Elon Musk, and the new space race was from Brad Bergen. We had Brad on the podcast as well. He was a great chat, a great conversation about all things space and culture and all that stuff. Go check that out. We're going to have all the links for these in description of the episode, so go check those out. And then there's, of course, the movie The Right Stuff, which for the first time I watched in full thanks to a friend this past, last 6 months. And it's truly, truly amazing and helps you understand how wild the times were, early days of space, and what it actually took to get people into space back then. And it just shows you how chaotic everything was, which is a great thing to look at when we look at today's world. The reason I'm saying all of this is because I am not a historian and I'm not going to pretend to be one, but I am a great researcher and compiler of big picture ideas. You know, I tend to take a more human and anthropological approach because, again, I'm no historian, so I wouldn't even know how to do that and wouldn't dare try to because it's just not my forte. So let's talk about the first space conundrum cycle. Think back to the original space race in the 1960s, a time of intense civil unrest against racial inequality, Cold War tensions, and global uncertainty. And yet, it led to one of the most unifying moments in human history, the moon landing of Apollo 11. Like we often say here on the podcast, for those who were not born yet for the Apollo landing, just ask anyone that was alive back then and remembers it and was able to watch it or listen to it. Most people will be able to tell you exactly where they were, and you can tell their eyes light up when they talk about it. It was such a major moment, might have been one of the first viral moments globally, way before the internet was even a thing. And then fast forward to today, Starship is preparing for Mars. Artemis will be reviving lunar exploration with multiple landers, including Starship and Blue Origin's Blue Moon lander. And commercial spaceflight is booming. But at the same time, the world is dealing with global instability, major economic shifts, a global pandemic, AI and automation threaten the jobs and purpose of large groups of humans. Politics has become unempathetic. The wage gap between rich and non-rich widens, while inflation and student loans make living and purchasing a home near impossible for most, my age and younger. Not to mention, it's difficult to know what sort of principles we stand for as a country, as a people, and as humanity anymore. And while the first space race cycle did end in a beautiful moment of common humanity between the US and Russia, which spread around the world and sparked a new age, it begs the question, what will be our symbolic moment of common humanity? That is, if we are correct and the cycle repeats itself and we actually get that moment. And if you look back at the history of the Apollo 11 landing, it almost didn't happen, and it's thanks to those three human beings who flew that spacecraft and the hundreds of thousands of people that were involved in making sure that the Saturn V rocket and the Apollo lunar lander and command module worked. So why does space progress bring chaos? The big question is why increased space progress is linked with increased societal chaos. And like most big questions, it's hard to truly answer why, but we can give some hypotheses. Hypothesis 1, space exploration is disruptive. It changes old ways of thinking, pushes technological boundaries, and shifts power dynamics. And that change, especially at this scale, can be unsettling. Could the disruption of the impossible cause the rest of us to question what else is possible? Common phrase you hear from the first space race era is, we can send someone to the moon, but we can't get this thing to work. Do crazy technological feats of physics change what we think is possible? And I can say for me, it definitely has. There are many moments that stick out to me over the last decade. The first Grasshopper landing, first SpaceX's Falcon, the first successful recovery of the Falcon 9 after many failures, a handful. The Falcon Heavy delivering the Tesla Roadster to space on the maiden flight and then landing both boosters successfully back on land. The James Webb Space Telescope finally deploying and unraveling in space and showing us the universe one image at a time, mind-blowing, and the amount of data we get back is insane. And then, of course, Starship's Super Heavy booster being caught for the first time for Flight Test 5 and Flight Test 7. But that first one really, really sticks out. And of that group, a lot of those are really culturally important and stick out in my mind. But also at the same time, we have AI developing, just like we had computers develop after the Apollo program, where they went from massive rooms for an entire computer to desktop PCs, and then eventually where we have things now. Do all these advances also break down the old ways and create a power dynamic? That one seems the most interesting to me. Does access to new technology shift how we think about life as well? Can that explain why the leading beliefs of the 50s were challenged in the 60s and 70s in society? Or is the correlation just coincidental and it's actually way more complex than that? Let us know what you think about Hypothesis 1 in the comments. Hypothesis 2. We invest in space when times get tough. The Apollo 11 moon landing wasn't just about exploration, as much as I would love it to be. It was about proving dominance in the Cold War. And while space dominance isn't necessarily top of mind these days, there are multiple wars going on here on Earth, and there's now a branch of the military completely dedicated to defending space. There's plenty of anti-satellite demonstrations and wild stuff like how China just dumps their rockets over the land of their own people, exposing them to very harmful propellants, and never mind a giant structure falling from the sky on these villages. And that's all in the sake of progressing and getting things for their space program further by not worrying about where the rocket lands. There's also a clear change in how much is invested in space from the 2000s to 2010 and now the 2020s. Going to Mars is the new buzzword over the men on the moon, and we may not have a JFK to mandate and fund going to the moon with defense level budgets, but we have had now 4 administrations being pro space and investing strategically over time. Now, I've asked guests on the podcast about the Space Conundrum and if they thought space could have a moment that brings us all together like the Apollo 11 moon landing. And the results are interesting. The optimists, writers, and enthusiasts tend to believe it could, while most of the industry CEOs and CTOs, thought leaders, people that are actually working in the industry, think that it won't. But who's right? Are we guaranteed peace at the end of this chaotic cycle? Or is it just that rapid progress itself is chaotic? And again, we don't think that we have the answers. This is our theory from observing, and we're still searching for the answer to why and why this correlation happens. So we want to hear your comments below, and hit us up on social media on what you think about hypothesis 2. So, what does this mean for us in 2025? Well, if I had to put us on a comparable timeline to the first space cycle, we are past the Mercury program, right? The early days of can humans even survive in space, 1958 to 1964, and we're at the start of the Gemini program. The Gemini program helped us develop what we needed for the Apollo program to go the next step, to understand that we needed a capsule and a lander and how to dock those in orbit and all those things. And that's where we find ourselves today. The SLS rocket and Orion are built for Artemis 2. They're still developing that, right? The heat shield didn't react like they wanted to, so that still needs to be adjusted, even if it's just a mission profile issue. We're coming into the atmosphere too hard at that angle and too fast is actually terrible for the heat shield. Starship is developing its ability to refuel in orbit, and they just lost the Starship in test flight 7, so there's a lot more development that needs to happen there. So to me, we're sitting at that early stage in that Gemini period before we reach even the moment that we could be in for our moon landing moment. So in my mind, there's still more to come, not to mention Blue Origin building their lander for the Artemis program to use after Starship. So the good news, we're about to see some serious acceleration of space progress. The bad news, just like the late 60s, I think things are going to be more difficult, and there's going to be more trials ahead of us for all. Some more than others, unfortunately. But this is the time to start figuring out what we each believe in and want out of our lives. Post-pandemic, I think we can all agree we're not the same people we were in 2019, and there's no going back. What it means is buckling down on finances, mental wealth, looking out for others, but also not letting the chaos overwhelm us and just focusing on what you can do. So if you believe the Space Conundrum, and it's actually a reflection of the first space race, and that we're building towards something great, we need to dig deep and search for what kind of world and humanity we want to have, because we need it, and we need you. So please take care of yourself. Stay off social media a little bit more and get into the world, make connections, or even if it's online, focus on the connections that you're making and less about the rush of dopamine that you get from a clip. You never know what it's going to lead to. And if I have any advice for these times, it's this. And I'm quoting here from something Gary Vee said on one of his posts. But you can do anything but you can't do everything. So figure out your mission and stay focused on what it is and what you need to do, and just shut out all the other chaos, because if there's one thing the Space Conundrum clearly got right, is that there is definitely more chaos that came along with more space progress. So whatever the why is, we know that chaos is here. So embrace it and only deal with as much chaos as you need to while you figure out what you need in life. I see a lot of people doing this, reevaluating, making sure that there are backup plans, and I wish all of you good luck. We're doing it here ourselves. So hang in there, and we hope the Space Conundrum leads us to another great moment in humanity, just like the last one. So, what do you think? Let us know in the comments what you think about the Space Conundrum, what you think about this link between space progress and societal chaos. Do you think there is a hard parallel between the first space race and today? Are we in for more chaos before we get some peace? And do you think the Space Conundrum is real? Let us know. Make sure to like and subscribe. Hit the bell here if you're on YouTube, if you love space content, and give us a review on Spotify and Apple Podcast. We really appreciate it. It helps a lot. Give us a 5-star review. Gets more people to see the podcast. Make sure to follow us at Today in Space Pod on Instagram and Twitter. Today in Space on TikTok. Today in Space Podcast on Facebook. And you can always email us at todayinspacepodcast@gmail.com, especially if you have an idea for the podcast, a question about space, all things space, or if you have someone or yourself who would like to be on our People of Science, to have an interview with us and we could chat about all things space. Make sure to spread love and spread science. Keep looking up, stay curious, and be good to yourself. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the All Things Space Science Podcast. Today in Space. We'll see you on the next episode.